Hello and welcome to an overview of the Rogue RTS Selection Plugin. The RTS Selection Plugin provides a system to be able to box select and individually select your entities in an RTS game setup. Currently at version 0.9. The reason why I'm not calling it version 1 at this point is because I haven't got a UI demonstration in. Once I get that in, it'll be version 1, but otherwise it's good to go. I hope to add the interface into the UI, like just an example, as soon as I can. Otherwise, it's got everything to communicate to a UI though, so if you've got your own, you shouldn't have any issue setting it up. If you are using the plugin and would like some support with it, I highly recommend go to Discord. Otherwise, I'm available on Patreon as well. You can also purchase the plugin on Patreon or support me there. All support is greatly appreciated. In the overview, I'm going to be covering the features of the plugin and what it does. I'll cover the installation, and I'm going to try and cover both a blueprint setup and C++ setup. I've done whatever I can to make this blueprint compatible. I'm not a user of blueprints, so if you do see anything in here that could be better in blueprints, do let me know. And then I'll cover some of the settings available, which just sort of ties into the features. I'll demonstrate if there's any bonus content from the example, and then we'll go into a code review, and I'll also cover the setup for C++ in that code review. So starting with a blank project, you should be right to use any of the templates here if you want to. I'm just going to choose a blank one. I'm going to choose a C++ project, and I'll just leave it as my project and put it in my usual directory. All right. Starting in a blank project, the first thing I'm going to do is just install the plugin, and to do that we just need to copy the files in. So I've got a project now, so this is either a new project or an existing project. The steps are the same here. I'm actually going to close this down. I'm going to come to wherever I've downloaded the plugin to. I'm going to extract it. So the file structure I should have is Rogue Selection folder with the contents inside. And I'm going to copy that. I'm going to come to my project, it was Unreal Projects, my project. And because this is a new project, I don't have a plugins directory, but if you do have a plugins directory, you'll go in there, but I'm going to create it and paste it in. So the structure is your project directory, plugins, Rogue Selection. I'm going to relaunch I might do it through C++ since we'll need that later. And I'm going to build the project. If you don't want to load the C++, you can just double click on my project and it will ask you, it'll say Rogue Selection has not been built. Do you want to build it? And just click yes. While that's building in the C++, the steps that we're going to take are inside this README file in your Rogue Selection folder. If you open that, you can see all what we're going to cover here. So the first two steps is what we're doing now. Looks like a lot, but it's not. These, you can either do it in the editor using these steps here and these steps here, or you can copy the entries directly into the game.ini and default engine.ini. I'm going to just show how to do it in the editor though. Unfortunately, the config files don't come across in the plugin, so there's just a few settings we've got to add, but you may have existing settings in your game also, so I can't just give you a whole config file, but they're very easy to add. So the first one is we just need to add an asset. You can change if you use this asset or not, but to get the demo working, we're just going to add this. So the name of it is the selection config data, and if you just search Rogue Selection, and there's a config data asset, and then you can point it to the plugin directory. And it's in the data directory. If you're not seeing the plugin directory, I'll show you how to fix that. You can just come to your content browser, settings, show plugin content, and you can see here it's got the folder for plugin content, and that will turn it off and on. So this is where all the Rogue Selection stuff is, in this content folder here. And once we've added that, you can add another directory here. So if we're going to say create our own config, we can, in the game content directory, we can add that directory there. This is basically where it will look for these configs. And then the other setting, this is optional, but I highly recommend it. The adding trace channels. So you might have existing trace channels here. If you are copying direct from the README file, just ensure that your game trace channel numbering doesn't override. So if you've already got some other custom channels, this might not be 1 and 2. It might be 4 and 5 or something like that, depending how many other custom ones you got. You just don't want the same numbers. It's not going to affect what the number is because we set it in the settings. So it's going to go new trace channel. I'm going to call this one terrain. And you want the default to be ignore. And basically what that means is every object in the game is going to ignore this channel unless you tell it specifically not to, and that's what you want. You only want the terrain to be able to block that one. I'm going to create another one called selectable. And the reason why I say these are optional is you can just use the visibility channel. So it's up to you. So here you go. And then if you can see here, there's the rogue selection settings. And we need to come into here and the box selection, because this is saved in your default game it's lost its reference to this. So I'm going to tell it to repoint to this. And if you want to find this, it's in that plugin directory, UI selection, and that's it there. You can open that up and edit that's just what the box looks like on the screen when you do a box select. And then the other settings here is that trace channel. So you can change this one to selectable and this one to terrain. And then I might as well cover these settings over here. So this is how far the mouse will project into the world to try and click on something. So if you're using something that's really far away for a reason, this might not be enough, or you don't want to do a line trace that's so long, you can shorten it down and optimize it. The box selection drag threshold is when you start a box selection, when does it change from a selection to a box selection? You can tweak that. And this selection marker threshold, you can see there wherever it tells you what these are, but it's the distance when an entity's, the marker system has destination and selection and preview markers built in. We're not going to really show it here, but as the entity approaches a destination marker, you don't want the selection marker of the entity and the destination to overlap. So as it approaches, it gets rid of the destination. That's what the distance is there. I wouldn't worry too much about that at the moment. The other settings are the selection system's built to work with groups or no groups. So that's what this is. And you can force it to only select groups. And I'll show you those once we get it going. So I'm going to load up the example map and it's in maps. If you do load up and there's nothing loaded, you can go to world partition. So window, world partition editor, and just highlight an area of the map, and it'll be, it might look like this when you're loaded. Just wherever you are, just load a section. You'll be able to just see the map. Won't be so freaky. It'll load when you press play anyway. But the other thing I want to do is just check the collision. It should be set to custom, and the terrain should be set to block. It looks like it's remembered that, so that's fine. This may turn off and on, particularly if you have different IDs like I was talking about. But if you have any trouble with this, just jump on the Discord. Actually, before we launch, when you mess with the data assets, it can mess up even existing ones. So we're just going to come into data, open up the data asset, and just set this back to none and save it, and then set it back to the selection config data and save it. And then under characters, just in here, this is the one that's used in the example. Under the marker component, I'll go through this later, but just come into here and you can see this data is corrupted. I thought it would be. So just reassign it to the config, and that'll stop us having any issues. Save that. But now that's done, we should be able to demonstrate the plugin. By the way, if you want these animations to work on these, it's just an idle animation. You can put the anim to texture plugin in, and it'll work with all these animation textures. I won't worry about it for now. We should be able to select now, so you can hold a mouse and select, and we can individually select. And the other thing we can do is, if we've already got some selections, we can hold Shift and add to that selection, or we can hold Alt and removed from the selection. And if we hold Control, it's a group selection. So if you have the force group on, this will work the same. But if you hold Control, you can, if you just get it over, just like not the full group, it's still highlighting the full group. If we go into the settings and enable that, use group selection only, the group selection will do the whole group. You can see there. And that is about it. So to set this up with our own project, let's go back to our list. So in our list we've done the asset and the trace channels. That's it there. So we've done all that, and now we need to set up the entity. So assuming you've got your own characters in your game, or you could use the if you're using the top-down template, you'll have the Unreal character or something like that. Same setup. Let's look at setting up the plugin in Blueprints. So if we come to Blueprints and we create a new character, so this would be the same as if you use the Unreal. You don't have to create a new character here. You could just use the Unreal, top-down character or third-person character or something like that, or whatever character you're using in your game. So the first thing I want to do is add the Rogue Selection Manager. So this is what handles all the decals underneath the entity when selected. And then on that Selection Manager, we just want to add that data asset. So this data asset is just the look of the detail, so the material and the effect. Some destination stuff in there we're not using in the plugin at the moment. And this is just how large the marker is if you've got a bigger character or something, and that's the offset off the ground in height. It does conform to terrain. This is just a bit of a wheel room to prevent any Z fighting or whatever if the terrain's not totally even or something like that. And then the other thing we need to do is add the interface. So we're going to come to Class Settings and then down to Implement Interfaces, and we're just going to search for Rogue, and we've got the Entity Interface. So that'll give us some functions that we need to override. The three functions are Set Group ID, Get Group ID, and Is Selectable. And we can override them here. They'll come up in here. So we also need some variables. So we're going to need a group ID, and we don't really need anything else, but we're going to put in a variable for is dead. So just an example of a dead check that you might have. And then the other one is it's just going to be group ID. You can call this whatever you want, but it just needs to be an integer if you want to use this group ID. And then that in there, and then we can just override those functions. So we can override get group ID, and that's obviously just going to return the group ID. Well, that's fine. And then the other one is set group ID. There's that one here, so we're just going to set that. Done. The last one is is selectable. So this is a function where you can build in anything that excludes this object from being selected. So, whether it's some temporary variable or such as is dead, it's dead. We don't want it to be included in actually we need to reverse that. So if it's not dead, then it's selectable. So if this returns false, basically, it's going to be excluded from the selection, and you can have whatever checks in here. All right. So that's the entity done. If we come back to our list, we have just done this part here. We've overridden those functions. And now we need to set up our player controller class. So again, whether you're doing a new player controller or just adding this to your existing one, all you need to do is we'll come back to Blueprints here and add it here and go player controller. So we've got our existing player controller, and we just need to go to Class Settings, Implement Interface, and you would have seen it before. It's the player interface. This one's the interface back, so this is what you'll interface back to your UI with, and this is returning from the selection subsystem what's selected and its state. So you're going to have an array here of, so if we do like a for loop here and then break this, you can see that you've got your, there's an array of selections which are groups. I'll show you the data in C++ later, but and then that's got the entities, a lead in the group, a group ID, and whether the selection is a select or unselect. And you can pass this to your UI, which in version 1 of this, we'll have an example UI and how to talk to it through this blueprint setup or through C++. And the other override is an important one because you'll need this to get the selection system working. Well, you at least need to pass an array of actors in that you want to be selectable. So wherever you have created your units, you want to call this interface on the player and pass in your entities. So if this is our player controller that we're using, we'll have an array here of units. So like our player units. Maybe an actor, an array of actors, and we'll need to pass that into the selection system, and that's what this function is for. So if we come to, actually I need to search for it in here. Sorry, I'm not too familiar with blueprints. It'll be under Rogue, and here it is here, and we want the message one. This one. So that's going to call, so this is implemented in C++, so we don't need to implement it. And then you just call this wherever, so there's going to be some point where you spawn the player's entities, and after that point is where you'd want to call this. So you might have a custom event here, and it's selection maybe, and you just call that event and pass the list of those entities in. You can override this function and do it yourself, but all this set player entities does is it gets the selection system and it calls an initialization function. So if we get the Rogue selection system from the player, so the local player one, get like Rogue selection system. I think I just selected the wrong one before. So that's the selection subsystem, and then on there's a function called initialize selection subsystem, and this is what triggers the whole thing. And again, just pass in the reference to your player controller and your player unit. So you do one or the other, is what I'm saying. I'll show you this function when we get into C++, but it's basically what this does. It gets the subsystem and passes in the entities. So that's all you need to do to set up a controller to use the selection system. All right, let's switch over to the C++ now. So in our C++ editor, whichever one we're using, we'll just come to Plugins, Rogue Selection. If you're not seeing plugins or you're not seeing Rogue Selection, delete your binary files and reload. I'm just going to run through this now. So this is the component for. So if you've done the RTS framework series, you'll see this component, and there'll be 3 of them. There'll be one for selection, one for destination, one for previews. This has basically been all rolled into one now. So you only have to add this one component now to an entity, and you get the whole setup for displaying selections and destinations and previews and things. We're obviously only using the selection one here. The data, there's the developer settings, which are the project settings for the plugin, as we've already gone through in the editor. And then that's the configuration data. So that's the material for the selection visualization. And then you've got your data types. So in here is so these structs are just for the selection subsystem. And then these are if you're in here, this is this struct here. So this is the selection group, and it's got the group ID and the entities in there. And then there's also a selection struct, which has an array of groups and has a selection lead. And the reason why I've put the leads in is if you're doing some sort of formation setup, it's really handy to have a point to reference off. So that's built into it. And if you don't want to use any of these features, it's fine, including if you don't want to use groups. You'll just have the one group, and it'll just be one group in this groups array. So it'll be, groups.entities is the setup. But if you do want to change this data, I'm happy to help with that. You can simplify it right down to just an array of actors or something like that for the whole thing if you're not using any other setups. But it will work without groups is what I'm saying. But you'll still just need a group ID of 0. So to cover what we covered in the blueprints is within the entities. So to set up an entity is, and exactly like we did in blueprints, you'd implement this interface and you'll implement these functions. So the is selectable, get and set group ID. And in this example entity, I've just got, like is dead is disabled just to show how you can set that up as, so it'll check. But if you've got an existing project that has some sort of checks that you want to make someone excluded from selection, then you can just handle that in there or call another function that handles it. And then this is the component. So in order to get the selection system all working on an entity, you just need to implement this interface, add this component, and obviously create the component. And you want it to replicate because it's a client-side thing, as most visual things are. And that's all you need. And then for a player controller, same sort of thing. Implement the interface, override the delegate, so you can bind to that, and then you can use that bind to this delegate to make any calls when a selection changes. The rest of this stuff in the player controller is just to use the example. In the game mode is where, so I'm logging in, setting the sort of to RTS mode view with the mouse pointer, and then I'm spawning the entities. So if you want a function that spawns stuff in a grid and in groups, this will be a good little example. But you can see at the end, all I'm doing is calling that interface on the player, and I'm executing that set player entity. So that will come into here. So that will come into the into the player interface. That's going to call C++ implementation if you haven't overridden it in blueprints, and it's just doing that exactly like we did in blueprints, getting the subsystem and calling that initialize the selection subsystem. There's a few libraries in here just for blueprint functions, mostly for the selection data, but there's some there for the modifiers as well, similar to the RTS camera. And then the UI is just there will be more UI in the final version, but at the moment it's just the widget for the box select. And then the subsystem's the main thing. So you've got some interfacing functions here. So we've already talked about the initialize the subsystem. You can see it's creating the box selection widget and then assigning widgets, assigning the entities to the subsystem, and then it's building some data arrays so it can efficiently go through those entities. And then the other ones here is so you might want to add or remove entities at runtime. So you might be spawning units from a base that builds units or something, and you might want to add them to selection, or when units die, you might want to remove them. So that functionality is there. And then this is where you interface your controls to. So you're going to have some input setup, and there's an example if you come to this Rogue, actually it's in the player controller. That pawn is pretty empty, but it's just the basic RTS camera setup that's in the player controller. So you can see when I do input select and hold, so that's the bind input, I'm just forwarding it to the selection subsystem, start select, hold select, and end select. And that's how you interface to selection. And then the subsystem will handle all the box drawing and all that as long as you've assigned it in the project settings. This whole setup with box selection is pretty similar to the RTS framework, but I've gone and optimized it a bit. So it's using a bit of a data-oriented approach to just going through the entities. So you should be able to handle a lot more entities without any visible lag. It's just pumping the checks through a parallel for. And I think that's about it. That kind of covers everything. Thanks for watching, and thanks for using the plugin if you've grabbed it. I want to thank the Patreons for their support. It's really appreciated. And if you're looking to purchase the plugin, it's available on Patreon at the shop. Thanks for watching.